going to start with a poem by who I think is the greatest modern Greek poet, C.B. Cavafy. In Perimetonotas tous Vaveros, Waiting for the Barbarians, written in 1904, he tells a community who assembled in wait for the barbarians who are about to arrive today. And someone asks him, someone asks in the poem, why is our emperor up and about so early and seated at the grandest table of our city, upon the throne in state, wearing the crown? Because the barbarians will arrive today and the emperor expects to receive their leader. Why have our two consuls and praetors come out today in their purple embroidered togas? Why did they put on rings, glittering emeralds? Because the barbarians will arrive today and such things dazzle the barbarians. Then suddenly the scene in the poem changes and there was commotion, confusion. The citizens' faces all turned solemn, the squares emptied. Why? Because night has fallen and the barbarians have not come. And some people have arrived from the frontiers and say that there are no barbarians anymore. And now, what will become of us without barbarians? Those people were some sort of solution. This was the poem, of course, Coetzee was reflecting upon in his novel, Waiting for the Barbarians, 1980. And I think it is as good as any other way for us to approach the question of public intellectuals and the role of the historian. Both of these writers, I think, attempt to sort of nudge us towards addressing those great, intractable fault lines of our time, including those most seismic, ever-shifting, ever-grinding tectonic plates, always cast, of course, in highly problematic dualisms, the barbarian versus civilized, the West, the rest, human, animal, nature, culture, universal, local, Christianity, Islam, privileged, underprivileged, and so on, and so on. Both Cavafy and Coetzee understand the fragility of living in interdependent worlds and are consequently ambivalent about how we ought to go about forging more just and more beautiful worlds. Is it the human lot to require barbarians? Is the barbarian other simply a blank slate upon which we inscribe our brutal empires? Do these others offer some kind of solution, as Cavafy would have it? Can history be valuable in negotiating these fault lines and divisions? Now, for those of you here familiar with Cavafy's writings, you'll remember that the empire in his poem was bounded by rigid laws, not fluid histories, laws made by the senators, scrolls upon which only the best names were inscribed. The result was, of course, a partial, limited, and limiting history. In Coetzee's novel also, we hear that the barbarians wiped their backsides on the town's archives, showing their disrespect for history. In a world balanced precariously on the fault lines of ethnicity, biopolitics, necropolitics, not to mention the Anthropocene, what is the role of the historian as the public intellectual? Now, I think Cavafy and Coetzee share a great deal with historians. In particular, I think we share this sensitivity to the role of foundational fictions in human societies. For Cavafy, the non-appearance of the barbarians threatens to disturb those tectonic plates that, for citizens safely ensconced within the walls of the empire, move so slowly that their privileges seem natural and right. The work of the intellectual is in opposition to this tendency, as Barbara Johnson put it in her wonderful introduction to Derrida's Dissemination. Critique involves reading backwards from what seems natural, obvious, self-evident, or universal, in order to show that these things have their history, their reasons for being the way they are, their effects on what follows from them, and that the starting point is not a natural given, but a cultural construct, usually blind to itself. So historian, poet, novelist, all involved, and philosopher, all involved in the work of critique that is inseparable from the alias of public intellectual. But in other words, the public, I will be arguing, the public of the public intellectual refers to the common good. The public intellectual is the individual who facilitates the production of the public good. The public of public intellectual does not refer to the medium, infotainment, if you like, for consumers. It is not a matter of brute numbers, a kind of celebrity, if you like, intellectual celebrity, whose value can be assessed through the accountancy logic of the marketplace, a rather masculine, if you like, competition involved in assessing the size of so-called public intellectuals' audience and ego. Instead, the public is defined according to the goals or intentions of the intellectual, the public intellectual engaged in struggle for the common good. Now, in contrast to this definition, controversial French writer Bernard-Henri Lévy defined the intellectual thus: intellectual, noun, masculine gender, a social and cultural category born in Paris at the moment of the Dreyfus affair, dead in Paris at the end of the 20th century, apparently not able to survive the decline of belief in universals. Now, I love this definition. What are we to make of this definition? Now, we may agree with him that the term intellectual was a product of the Dreyfus Affair of 1898. I mean, most people here will know about this, but for those that you don't, Dreyfus, a Jewish army officer accused by anti-Semitic nationalists in France of spying for the Germans. Now, Dreyfus's enemies coined the word intellectuals in their attempt to discredit those prominent thinkers who rushed to Dreyfus's defense. According to them, the intellectual was the decadent, the anti-nationalist, the Jewish. Dreyfus's supporters grasped this term, however, and they inverted its meaning. The intellectual was scientific, democratic, politicized. And within months, this word, this concept, intellectual, had spread throughout Europe and America. And in England, it entered the debates prominently from 1914, generally in quotation marks, it's always kind of Frenchy, imported by opponents of the war. And after the war and the Russian Revolution, the term became generalized, replacing the older term man of letters. But everything else in Lévy's definition is contested, of course. Take gender masculine, thus embracing Jean-Paul Sartre, but not Simone de Beauvoir. Lévy himself, but not Susan Sontag. And has, in fact, the decline in belief in universals hastened this male intellectual's death? Quite the contrary. Even that most Marxist of historian intellectuals, I'm talking here about Eric Hobsbawm, who died a few months ago, flourished in the postmodern age, understanding that the role of the intellectual was that of interpreting and accusing. And part of what he was required to interpret was the rise of new universals and not emancipatory ones. He reflected on this at one point in his autobiography, where he describes that he was in hospital on 9/11 and witnessed the carnage on the ward's television. There was no better place, he wrote, than a hospital bed to reflect on the world. The sick bay was the locus of a captive victim. As he recalled, I saw it, 9/11, on a London hospital television screen as it happened. For an old and skeptical historian born in the year of the Russian Revolution, it had everything that was bad about the 20th century. Massacres, high but unreliable technology, the announcements that a global struggle to the death between the causes of God and Satan were now taking place once again. His task, and I believe it remains ours today, was, of course, to problematize such universals. God, Satan, the ubiquity of the neoliberal economic and ideological systems. Public intellectuals, like Eric, are passionate about exposing those things that seem, wrongly, to be universal features of humanity, showing the specificities of the past, showing the how and the why these things came to pass, and thus enabling us to imagine more emancipatory futures. Perhaps, and I'm guessing here, Eric would agree with me that the harsh critiques that historians often receive from self-proclaimed radicals and revolutionaries of the left, in other words, bluntly put, that historians are nothing more than vulgar empiricists, perhaps is completely misplaced. Perhaps the much vaunted weakness of history as a discipline is actually one of its strengths, at least for the public intellectual. History is a profession that has been conventionally resistant to abstractions. It seeks out the material of human existence, words, objects, other traces that have been left behind by people of the past. For all the denunciation of humanism, including in my own book, What It Means to Be Human, history is a profoundly humanistic profession. And in a post-human world, this encourages this turn to specificities, temporal, geographic, relational. Historians, as public intellectuals, fight against the tendency to see peoples in the past simplistically as the other, against whom we, whoever we might be, are constituted. Erasing the awe-inspiring variety of sentient life impoverishes all of our lives. As I argue in What It Means to Be Human, in the 21st century, historians have this duty to celebrate the unsubstitutable singularity of peoples who have struggled and submitted to forces within and beyond their control in the past. In other words, abstract ideas, cardboard cutout figures, and assertions of formal equality are inadequate to deal with problems of social justice. This is not, of course, to romanticize the status and standing of the historian as public intellectual. I mean, a few years ago, historian and critic Stefan Collini published a perceptive but extremely ill-tempered critique of intellectuals as other people. And in it, he launched this huge attack on intellectuals who romanticized other intellectuals as somehow the only true thinkers within society, loftily superior, if you like, to all others, making pronouncements on what is right and good, while claiming at the same time, of course, to be Democrats and of the people. He stressed that we need to emphasize the sheer ordinariness of the role of the intellectual, the fact that they are simply doing their job and are part and parcel of a much wider public enterprises. Now, I strongly support his rallying call that we need to emphasize the sheer ordinariness of the public intellectual, but his argument, I think, risks two things at least, which I don't agree with. First, his disdain is actually, of course, reserved to a particular kind of public intellectual, that is, the vis, male, elite, Westerner. After all, no one ever doubted that the ordinariness of the public intellectual in those revolutions described as local, or public intellectuals who are women, immigrants, the dispossessed. Second, even if we focus only on Collini's privileged public intellectuals, they are a product, of course, of elitist economic and cultural backgrounds, which are radically unegalitarian. By stressing the ordinariness of these intellectuals, Collini risks naturalizing their positions within society. In other words, he risks fortifying the assumption that men and women who have benefited from highly privileged elite education and can afford the privilege of long periods of thinking, coupled with access to the mass media, somehow merit their status as ordinary. But what about, I'll skip that. Perhaps, there is the other argument about, or definition, most cited definition, if you like, about what it means to be an intellectual. And here, of course, I'm referring to the definition of the intellectual as one who speaks truth to power, an elegant turn of phrase. Undergraduates love it, except, of course, nearly all of us feel distinctly queasy when we think of that word truth. It's become a reflex to ask, well, whose? The idea of a universal truth, a common understanding of good versus evil, is something something many of us find problematic. And then, of course, this false dichotomy, the assumption that somehow power and knowledge are external to each other, which it's sort of this zero-sum game, which Foucault made us all jettison quite a long time ago. Perhaps, though, it is here that Badiou's reconsideration of the concept of universal truth for the 21st century is helpful. Truth in his vision does not describe a pre-existing state of affairs, but is something that happens. It's an event which must be maintained in order to remain true. Importantly, the person must be committed, must, if you like, express fidelity to the truth of the event. The public intellectual striving for the public good, the common good, is the one who remains faithful to ideas of justice and equality within the historical context of the 21st century. In other words, the role of the intellectual is ideological. It is political practice. Performing this political labor is our contribution to society. Intellectuals are people who don't mind their own business. They are the court jesters in modern history and politics. Now, does this make the public intellectual necessarily progressive and leftist in politics? And I think my argument here is yes, it does, and certainly it does in terms of its historical meaning. However, in the popular mind, intellectual and academic have in fact been fused. In this reading, intellectuals are almost exclusively identified with university employees. The grand cognitive fields of philosophy, history, letters, law have broken up into a myriad of disciplines and subdisciplines. University life under state policies and funding priorities have become increasingly solitary, intellectually isolated, strictly controlled and managed for policy compliance and economic impact, and we've heard a lot of that already today. The result has been this creation of the academic as both a prop for power and a distraction from those higher powers or enterprises. In other words, entertainers. They offer sound bites that mostly confirm the banal. They offer props for arguments rather than disruptive evidence. The entertainers, of which I have to admit that many are historians, present series, of course, on the glories of Greece or the British Empire, which mix the simplistic with the fanciful. In a situation of conflict, objectivity becomes, or tends to become, the best disguise for ideological partisanship. Today, the global community concerned with issues of justice and emancipatory politics has entered, I think, a new perilous phase, with the strongest and most violent nation in the world repudiating some of its most fundamental tenets. Threats of war are first resorts. Negotiation afterthoughts, drone warfare, enabling attacks by foreign governments on any part of the world without regard to international borders, and we can all think of hosts of other examples. My point is simple. Something must be wrong with humanitarian war and human rights law if they can be appropriated by any cause, moral or immoral, and can degenerate into a kind of accountancy in which some people's desire to avoid pain, desire of rich Western people to avoid a single terrorist strike, trump other people's pleasures, the comforts of thousands of people wounded through drone attacks. And this, I think, is where the public intellectual actually has a great deal to say, pointing out the long use of humanitarian and human rights politics for repression. 18th century, rights of man conceived of by Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner. 19th century, the language of sympathy, the language of humanitarianism used by people like the novelist and feminist Edgeworth to support slavery. The 20th century, with regards colonial peoples, languages of rights and democracy have been fundamental in rendering torture customary and underlying norm. If there is a crisis of public intellectuals, it is not because there is too little work to do, but indeed too much. So in other words, this is a very exciting time to be a public intellectual. The ways of protesting have grown phenomenally, including even the rise of protests within computer gaming, and I've been interested in that for quite a while. More broadly, since 2008, the economic and financial crisis had led many people on the right, as well as the left, to feel that it is possible to question the rule of capital. The bankruptcy of a society focused on science, materialism, and managerialism has been brought brutally to the fore. The simplest of technologies, the nail bomb, the poison gas, have come crashing into everyone's consciousness in the West, reminding us of the costs of our defiant provincialism. We are living, I think, in a time of revolutions comparable to those of 1968 or 1989. And this is where the public intellectual, as a historian, I think, can contribute to the process of negotiating the fault lines and divisions today. We can use that great power of narratives of the past to disrupt those foundational fictions of our times, to remind us that justice does not materialize, if you like, out of universal, timeless moral truths, but are a function of social struggle in the real world, that is, in real historical time. Justice as a form of culture, or imagining the real. It requires specific modes of agency and constructions of the self. In this process of creating and recreating more just societies, the role, I think, of the historian is to insist on maintaining those tensions intrinsic to living in interdependent worlds and the contingent nature of our foundational fictions. As the colonel said to the magistrate in Coetzee's novel, "You want to go down in history as a martyr, I suspect, but who is going to put you in the history books? Those border troubles are of no significance. People are not interested in the history of the back of beyond. There will be no history. The affair is too trivial." And this is what historians as public intellectuals, of course, strive against, drawing attention to those fault lines, to those border troubles, which are, of course, of great significance, and to remind ourselves that for the lived experiences of people in the past, no affair is too trivial. Intellectuals are not people who exercise responsible critique. They are those with a knowledge of self, of the good and the beautiful. As with that first generation of intellectuals who were committed to social justice, they spoke only partly as experts, and to a much larger extent as spokesperson of a political vision of truth. For these public intellectuals, truth was not the objective outcome of cognitive processes, but a domain of struggle one enters armed with moral principles, historical awareness, and political categories which judge, criticize, resist. Truth and the universal do not mirror reality, but are strategies to change it. As I state in What It Means to Be Human, the public intellectual points to a politics of history that is as committed to the uniqueness of all life forms as much as to the creative, exhilarating desire, albeit unattainable, and struggle for community and communion, authenticity and certainty. Through the composition of history, we attempt not only to uncover the past, but to create it and create ourselves through critical dialogic exchange. In the current crisis, public intellectuals who are primarily historians have turned to an eclectic, interdisciplinary, expansive, total history, which casts a sharp, forensic eye on the dancer as well as the dance, the slave as well as the slave owner, the ideological as much as the economic. But I'd like to just conclude, I've got 1 minute left, my reflections by turning very briefly to another poet, not Cavafy in this time, but one of the great inspirations in my own life, and that is that great poet Adrian Rich, who died last year at the age of 83, and whose glossolalia, worldly sophistication, and political commitment have always been inspiration to me. In one of her poems, Rich reflected, like Eric Hobsbawm, on lying in a hospital bed, watching, after one of her grueling operations, listening to a radio account of another massacre. She asked her readers to remember that, quote, "The body's pain and the pain on the street are not the same, but you can learn from the edges that blur. Oh, you who love clear edges more than anything, watch the edges that blur." It is a politics that encourages readers and historians to dive into unfamiliar waters, into the stew of contradictions that make up human lived experiences, into solidarity with other tormented bodies. By writing with the suffering body, Rich holds open the possibility of solidarity with others who are also living their lives, as she put it in another poem, not under conditions of their choosing, wired into pain, riders on the slow train, a poetics and a history that resist passive suffering, drenching the body in pain with a recognition of the what if, the possible. This, in my view, is the aim of the historian as public intellectual, to tell stories that both breathe life into peoples in the past, the housewife, the laborer, other peoples who have been the greatest driving force in history, but also the inspiration for systematic violence, and to captivate those around us with these stories. Social injustice still needs to be fought and denounced. The world, in other words, just won't get better on its own. Thank you.
My talk is called The Intellectual Debate in the Digital Age. I thought I would use my background as a journalist to give a slightly different spin on things, since those of us practicing journalism find ourselves in a very strange and curious position in the last several years. Sometimes one feels like an illuminator of manuscripts circa 1460 or 1470. In any event, in 1821, in his defense of poetry, Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. In a different key, in his 1956 poem, America, Allen Ginsberg wrote, "Are you going to let our emotional life be run by Time magazine? I'm obsessed by Time magazine. I read it every week. Its cover stares at me every time I slink past the corner candy store." The idea of our emotional life being run by a weekly news magazine seems as quaint and old-fashioned, as much from another century, from another millennium, as does the idea of poets being the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Even if one thinks of the great impact that a book such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago had on world opinion when it was published in 1973, it seems only at a distance of 40 years ago, seems to belong to another world, an age of ideology in which books and ideas mattered more than they do now. So who are the unacknowledged legislators of our 21st century world? The inventors of Google, Facebook, the iPhone, the anonymous writers of computer code that design websites and apps for our smartphones and tablets, who are changing not only what information we have access to, but how we read and acquire information, reshaping the ways in which we think. The impact of digital media on public discourse has been varied and complex, a classic and very rapid case of creative destruction. Old, extremely established features in American journalism and also European have literally been eliminated from the scene. I began my journalistic career working for the weekly news magazine Newsweek, which closed its doors earlier this year, but which only 25 years ago was a rich, fat, and happy staple of American cultural life. The only one of the three major news magazines left standing is Time, but now a shadow of its former self, hardly the icon of conformist opinion that so terrified Allen Ginsberg. Scores of American media institutions have ceased to exist, and others are shadows of their former selves. The number of working journalists in the United States has dropped from about 52,000 in 2007, the beginning of the recent financial crisis, to just 38,000. Revenue among Italian newspapers last year dropped by 25% in 1 year, and that was after a series of successive and very dramatic drops in the years before that. But declining employment numbers or financial numbers are not necessarily the problem. A fraction of the people who used to make cars in automobile factories now make as many or more cars as before, and many of them are safer and more fuel efficient than they were 40 years ago. But what matters is the declining resources of newspapers that have changed what kinds of stories are reported and what we read and hear and watch. In trying to save themselves, most medium to large newspapers in the United States immediately eliminated all of their foreign bureaus, most or all of their national bureaus, got rid of their investigative reporting units. Story lengths have shrunk as people want shorter stories to read online, and weather, sports, and traffic make up nearly half of all local television news. The overall global effect of the digital revolution has been twofold. On the one hand, it has undermined the traditional economic basis of media, advertising, subscription, and newsstand sales. At the same time, by creating a virtually free form of publication, it has greatly lowered the cost of entry for others to speak and have their voices heard. We have lost tens of thousands of journalism jobs, but at the same time, there are 6.7 million bloggers and tens or hundreds of millions worldwide, but all but a few of them work for free. On the one hand, in breaking down the barriers between traditional media and other institutions, as well as private individuals, it has made entry into the public discourse available and virtually free to anyone. This allowed many academics or other non-journalists who were previously unknown to the general public to become public figures, creating websites that have achieved a wide and influential readership. Various not-for-profit organizations, universities, think tanks, foundations, human rights organizations, or just groups of people have become major providers of information, widely available and usually for free, that has greatly enriched public discourse. This has meant that many academics or ordinary individuals have been able to enter into public discourse who might have been limited in their access through traditional forms of media. People like the Berkeley economist Brad DeLong has a quite popular blog in which you can read complex and detailed analysis of economic issues. University of Chicago economist Gary Becker and Judge Richard Posner have an extremely interesting blog where they comment on important issues of the day from a conservative point of view. Juan Cole, a scholar of religion and Middle Eastern history, created the blog Informed Comment, which is a major source of depth and context in trying to understand Middle Eastern affairs. Two lawyers began a website called SCOTUS Blog, which has become an essential source of information, an interpretation for people wanting to understand the American Supreme Court and major legal issues in our country. These sorts of things have added significantly to the depth and complexity that's available to the public. Another feature of online journalism is the ability to place links into stories, allowing reader to search out the primary sources of stories, so that a story that refers to a major scientific study or scholarly paper can allow you to click on to the original study so the reader can actually see whether the journalist or author has made good use of primary sources. While an economist such as Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman was extremely well known before the internet, his views are spread worldwide because some 50 million people a month look at the New York Times online, while only 1 million people would read its print edition. Oxford biologist Richard Dawkins has gained a world audience by challenging creationism and becoming a vocal champion for atheism. So in these ways, the digital revolution has been good for public intellectuals. It's opened up possibilities and created space for complex discourse. At the same time, there are other ways in which the digital revolution has hollowed out public discourse. One of the great casualties of the revolution we're living out is investigative journalism, traditionally one of the great strengths of American journalism. It was for many years a point of pride that every medium to large newspaper in the US would have its own unit of journalists who were freed from the responsibility of writing daily stories and would spend several weeks or even months pursuing a particularly complicated investigation. This was done when newspapers were profitable and could afford to do that, and they were done as a matter of pride. They'd be submitted for Pulitzer Prizes and would show that newspapers in Minneapolis or Sacramento could do just as well as the New York Times, the Washington Post at certain kinds of stories. But they added a lot they gave depth to news that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Virtually all these things were eliminated in the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. With newspapers literally fighting for their lives, they could no longer afford to have 4 or 5 journalists working for months on a single story. The reduced staff of these shrunken papers would have to do more with less, produce a story every day and 2 or 3 items to the website. To give you an idea of what this means in concrete terms, consider that in April of 2008, New York Times reporter David Barstow published a long story revealing a network of professional and financial relationships between a group of retired military men, retired generals and admirals, who appeared frequently on television news at the time of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. They were hired as experts because they were retired from the military. It was assumed that they had a certain dispassionate distance from the Pentagon and could give honest evaluation of the war. Barstow discovered by making literally hundreds of Freedom of Information Act requests that most of these retired military men were working for major defense contractors who had significant economic relationships with the Pentagon and depended on them. Many of them continued having close relations with their former colleagues, had meetings with them secretly that they didn't reveal, and in many cases were given talking points about the things they were supposed to talk about on air, things like emphasize victory, they were told in memoranda, which Barstow recovered. This story helped us better understand a crucial moment in our recent political history. The pertinent question, however, for this discussion is how many news organizations at the moment in the US or in the world can afford to have one of their full-time journalists spend an entire year on one story. The answer, I suspect, is 1, 2, or maybe none. At the same time, one of the positive effects of digitization is an ability to access, analyze, and represent much greater quantities of data than in the past. This has opened up space for interesting emerging figures such as Swedish statistician Henk Oosterling, who created, we're going to have a little look at this in case you haven't seen it, it's worth doing. I thought it would be kind of poor form to be talking about the digital revolution and not have anything from that world, so we could just have a quick look at Hans doing his thing. Is that set up?
Mindset. Does your mindset correspond to my data set? If not, one or the other needs upgrading, isn't it? When I talk to my students about global issues, and I listen to them in the coffee break, they always talk about we and them. And when they come back into the lecture room, I ask them, what do you mean with we and them? Oh, it's very easy. It's the Western world and it's the developing world. We learned it in college. And what is the definition there? Well, definition, everyone knows, they say. But then, you know, I press them like this. So one girl said very cleverly, it's very easy. Western world is a long life in a small family, and developing world is a short life in a large family. And I like that definition because it enabled me to transfer their mindset into a data set. And here we have the data set. So you can see that what we have on this axis here is size of family, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children per woman on this axis. And here length of life, life expectancy, 30, 40, 50. Exactly what the student said was their concept about the world. And really this is about the bedroom, whether the man and woman decide to have small family and take care of their kids and how long they will live. It's about the bathroom and the kitchen. If you have soap, water and food, you know, you can live long. And the students were right, wasn't that? The world consisted here of one set of countries over here, which had large families and short life, developing world. And they had one set of countries up there, which was the Western world. They had small families and long life. And you are going to see here the amazing thing that has happened in the world during my lifetime. And then the developing countries applied soap and water, vaccination, and all the developing world start to apply family planning, and partly to USAID, who helped provide the technical advice and investment. And you see all the world moves over to a two-child family and a life with 60 to 70 years. But some countries remain back in this area here. And you can see we still have Afghanistan down here. We have Liberia, we have Congo. So we have...
So you get an idea of what the possibilities of using large data sets in the hands of a smart, creative, public intellectual made available for free on the web can do, and they're great tools, and there's real complexity there, you see, in which, with all of his showmanship, he's actually showing us something quite important. One of the principal effects of digitization is what is called disintermediation, the removing of intermediaries in public discourse, the traditional gatekeepers who in the past have decided who has something worth saying and who does not. It has allowed people to recognize who are not recognized by the traditional established media to speak directly to the public. In this sense, the crisis of traditional media is their weakened status in mediating between the public and the political, intellectual, cultural leadership. Traditional hierarchical relationship has been replaced by a more complex interactive one in which the public is no longer passive but talks back in online comments, tweets, and its own blogs, while traditionally recognized figures must now compete with whoever stands up and makes himself or herself heard. Much of this is healthy and democratic and a genuine improvement over older paternalistic models in which there was a small elite that knew and a public that would be, to whom information would be transmitted. But disintermediation can produce some strange and sometimes disconcerting effects. In the United States, Ross Perot, a Texas billionaire, created an extremely successful political campaign coming out of nowhere to gather 19% of the vote in 1992. He did so primarily by buying large amounts of television time and avoiding the kind of questioning that usually takes place in political campaigns. Silvio Berlusconi took this a step further by speaking directly to the Italian public through his own massive media empire, and now more recently, the comedian Beppe Grillo used the internet in a rather extraordinary fashion to create a significant national political movement based primarily on a website. His story is highly emblematic for our time. If Berlusconi represents the political potential of television, Grillo is one of the first political figures to build a major movement largely through the internet. It is significant that Grillo's career began when he was kicked off Italian television for making fun of Italy's socialists. He then went out on the road and built a following through in-person performances, but then really took off when he created a blog in 2005, which incredibly enough became one of the single most visited blog in the world. For an Italian to have a blog visited by 60 million people is an incredible success. To give you an idea, he is not your usual idea of a public intellectual. He startled Italian life in 2007 by organizing something called Vaffanculo Day. You can imagine what that is, where he managed to convince hundreds of thousands of Italians to gather in squares all over Italy and simultaneously go to Italy's political class. But in 2010, people who took him lightly were surprised when his movement gathered 25% of the national vote. What Grillo represents is the possibility of a radically different form of democracy, a kind of direct democracy through the internet rather than the kind of representative democracy mediated by public intellectuals, political figures, and so forth. And he and his partner, Roberto Casaleggio, are very explicit in explaining that as the goal of essentially eliminating all kinds of mediation and having direct democracy. Whatever one may think of Grillo, and I personally don't like him, I was going to show a little clip of him, but for reasons of time I won't. You can just see him shouting, which is his, if you, go ahead. It gives you just a little bit of a flavor.
Allora, se dietro gli inceneritori ci sono la sinistra e io qua sono in una città, sono in una regione che è sempre stata di sinistra, che io non riconosco più perché io ci ho vissuto in Romagna, ci ho vissuto, ci ho avuto anche 2 figli, ho 2 figli in Romagna, so come siete dentro. So come siete dentro, ma è successa una cosa incredibile.
And it's a little disquieting when you hear certain echoes of other past demagogues of earlier times. This is someone who certainly does not resemble Hannah Arendt, Jean-Paul Sartre, or Isaiah Berlin, but he's created an extraordinary platform for promoting ideas. And one would be wrong to simply dismiss it as not important, because it is important. Similarly, in the world of American journalism, something like the Drudge Report, an inexpensively produced conservative news site, helped to break the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal. It's not everyone's idea of journalism, but is now part of the media landscape of our country. Like it or not, the internet, by breaking down the barriers of entry and getting rid of traditional gatekeepers, has opened up space for new players, some of them charming and brilliant, like Hans Rosling, and others considerably less polite. And so it is a kind of open free-for-all. One of the aspects of this free-for-all that worries me is a kind of balkanization of information, where people on the web tend to gravitate toward websites that confirm their existing convictions. Left-wing people move toward left-wing sites, conservatives to conservative websites, and become more extreme in the process. There's actually a lot of social science research that indicates when people are together with people who think the way they do, their views become more radicalized, whether on the left or the right. And so one of the forms of old-fashioned generalist newspapers was to force people to cohabit, and they moderated. When you actually have to have a conversation with someone who disagrees with you, you don't call them an idiot. You try to understand a little bit of what they why they think as they do. In the past 20 to 30 years, with the deregulation of broadcasting, the rise first of cable TV and now the internet, we've seen an extraordinary degree of polarization in the United States, but also in Italy, in which conservatives and liberal Americans live in entirely separate universes of information, and there is almost no common ground for discussion. In this polarized information world, it is possible for large numbers of Americans to believe that President Barack Obama was not born in the United States, is a Muslim, is not legitimately the president, and that he's purposely trying to destroy both the American economy and the capitalist system, despite an absence of factual basis for these views. We have moved into a kind of post-factual world where people believe what they want, and one sees the same thing going on in Berlusconi's Italy, another country where, interestingly, television was entirely deregulated. But one should not engage in too much nostalgia for the golden age of print journalism and print culture. After all, the Enlightenment in print culture did not prevent the rise of Hitler, Mussolini, or Stalin, or thousands of other smaller demagogues who thrived in the 20th century. Intellectuals, whether public or private, have always been a minority breed who have pushed against prevailing dominant opinion and will continue to be. Books have experienced much less of a dip than newspapers and magazines. Ideas still matter, for good or ill. It is still true, as Maynard Keynes early in the 20th century wrote, the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually slaves of some defunct economist. The digital world, if you lived through the last American presidential election and heard Paul Ryan, a fan of Ayn Rand, you'll know that to be true. But the digital world also opens up new possibilities for intellectuals who choose to engage with it. To conclude, an interesting example came recently in the United States over a paper published by two respected American economists at Harvard, Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff, who published a paper that indicated this, that economic growth became close to impossible after national debt exceeded a certain level. This paper then provided important intellectual support for economic austerity measures. A young American scholar took their study, redid their data, and showed that the paper had serious miscalculations and other mistakes which affected greatly its conclusions. The back and forth between the scholars and its critics became a major story on the internet, and this was a sort of debate in the past would have been confined to scholarly journals, but was today carried out openly and rapidly over the internet with hundreds of thousands of ordinary readers following and contributing. The lively debate showed, I think, that the internet does not have to be an enemy of complexity or of robust intellectual debate. Thanks.
Okay, philosophy is my trade, and I'm hooked on reflection, and I crave for discursive results. I deal with the impossible ideals and push concepts, poisoning the minds of generations of young kids. To most people, this perverted conceptual labor is as abstract as it is dangerous. It is performed by specialists who spend most of their time in their proverbial ivory towers of thought. Zombie-like creatures that haven't the faintest idea of what happens out there, in the real world, because the windows of their towers are sealed off with mirrors that narcissistically reflect the interiority of their thought. And on top of that, I'm an heir of those French philosophers who, after Sartre, cleansed the House of Humanities thoroughly with their postmodern vacuum cleaners. After structuralism and post-structuralism, discursive archaeologists like Foucault have unearthed the culturally biased presuppositions of the modern subject, declaring that man is about to disappear like a face drawn on the sand on the beach, washed away by the waves. And after Derrida deconstructed humanist-centered discourses on philosophy, literature, and law, Lyotard criticized the utopian urge of grand narratives of Kant, Hegel, and Marx, and feminist thinkers like Irigaray, Braidotti, Butler smashed the hegemonical pretensions of male fantasies. And Deleuze and Guattari proclaimed that man is a, what is man? An assemblage, just a node in a network that is interwoven into the fabric of his own desire. And when we all knew this, there wasn't much left to talk about. The communication of the humanities became smarter than smart, that is, cynical and nihilistic. Not a proper attitude for young people that enthusiastically want to explore and build their future on the firm basis of reliable facts and unshakable truth. On scientific proof, transforming their lives into evidence-based practices that allow them to live more than comfortable lives. Economics and engineering, the story goes, is preferred over humanities that are failing to attract students to its courses, seemingly on the grounds that there are no jobs for graduates. That's why one of the comments in the debate on the crisis in the humanities states, without a serious intellectual reorientation, the humanities will dwindle into insignificance. According to Harvard Dean of Arts and Humanities Sorensen, the solutions are clear. Even more aggressively market yourself, create broader interdisciplinary network, and develop internship networks. Others propose to create transdisciplinary networks in which disciplinary differences are recognized and respected by meaningfully engaging in each other's way of knowing. According to Sorensen, the task of the humanities still is, and I quote, to develop habits of mind, a sense of how to reason rigorously, how to express ideas in a compelling way, and how to write well. And then to have at your disposal the categories through which to approach complex problems. I couldn't agree more. It is all about the art of listening, she says, the art of reading, and the art of looking. But she forgets one specific ingredient of the humanities. One art is missing, the art of living. I don't want to suggest that professors of humanities are supermen or superwomen, the perfect role models who incorporate the ultimate wisdom. I only want to suggest that the search for a good life has always been part of the body of knowledge of the humanities. We talked about ethics, and I agree that ethics is not the real solution. So living the good life is always living the good life in the city, in the polis. From Aristotle to Hannah Arendt, speech and actions are constituents of the political. And contrary to physics, economics, or engineering, the humanities have always been explicitly political in this sense. Reflection on action. Reflection as action. Reflection with an A. That's what we have to do. So, and as Einstein said, he was referred to in the first talk, we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. So, we do a small film just to illustrate that.
Whoa, that's not good.
Oh, I don't need this. I'm already late.
Somebody will come. Anybody out there?
Do you have a phone?
No. Sorry. Somebody! Hello? There are two people stuck on an escalator and we need help. Now, would somebody please do something? Help! I don't believe this. You gotta be kidding me.
I'm gonna cry.
Well, there's not enough left to do, is there?
No, not yet, not yet.
Hello? Hey, don't worry about it. I'll fix it in a second.
He said he can fix it. All right. All right. That's more like it. He says he can fix it.
I think this is the problem. We were talking about this all morning, I think. So we're not going to find a solution. Not in this way. So, reflection. That is what we have to do with A, reflection. You don't hear it, you have to read it. That's important. Because that has always been at stake in the humanities, literacy. But until recently, the art of living was focused on the Renaissance, Homo universale, and even nowadays still is referring to the cult of the individual of the 19th century building. But as the inheritor of the vacuum cleaner, I realize that we have to affirm the paradigm shift of the discourse shift that has taken place already a few decades ago. The crisis of the humanities is not just an incidental accident. It's the same with the credit crisis. Although we all realized something really terrible was happening, now half a decade later we are back at business as usual. As with the credit crisis, the crisis in the humanities is just a superficial effect of a cultural earthquake. The 21st century project of the humanities is still about man and the city. But the city changed as a result of mediatization, you were talking about it, digitalization and globalization. And as a result of that, man changed. Technology always takes the lead, but reflection is needed on how we change from masters who invent into the slaves that consume. The present literacy we need is media literacy, and per implication, eco-literacy. Are the humanities prepared to draw the consequences of that state of being that is always a state of mind as well? Are the humanities prepared to take the lead once more in an emancipatory move to initiate a medial enlightenment instead of the mental enlightenment in taking mediatization of men serious. It won't suffice to even more aggressively market yourself. Creating broader inter- and transdisciplinary networks is a must. Develop internship networks within the academic field, okay. But what we really have to establish is a connection between the academia and public space. So the whole idea now, why does the influx of students in the humanities decrease? Because these kids want to find a decent job in order to earn loads of money? I don't think so. Although in some departments the anarcho-capitalist mentality of some groups of students is gruesome. Kids nowadays are much smarter than most professors can imagine. They are media savvy, but not media literates. They are conscious consumers, but not eco-literates. Perhaps they do not sign up for humanities courses because they do not recognize themselves in the curriculum. If that is so, we have to take the consequences and sincerely reflect upon our own actions. So let's try. That was 5 minutes, wasn't it? 5, okay. I've got another 15 minutes. So let's talk. So what did we do? So my point is that we have to more or less open up the university. We're all talking to each other now. We're all talking to each other. Okay. So we have to open up the university. But when you open up the university after you have studied, it's no use. So you have to open up the university while you're studying. And then we come back to the democracy. Of course, democracy is a story. It's a foundational fiction. But what I learned from Foucault and Deleuze and Derrida is that it is a practice before it is anything else. It is a discourse. So, if you want to learn students to be democratic, you have to create a practice for them to acquire the skills for being democratic. Not talk about democracy. So that's what we did. So in 2003, I tried to gain a grant from the Dutch scientific organization. Yeah, okay, MAO. And I had this big idea. I would do a research with a lot of groups, a network, opening up in the city, trying to get into schools, and really, really big, huge. And they didn't even read it. They didn't even read it. They thought, well, this is impossible. Okay, so. And then they asked me to give a lecture in Rotterdam, the Rotterdam lecture, and I explained why the situation in Rotterdam was as it was. It was after Pim Fortuyn was killed. We had a big conference in that year with the IAPL in Rotterdam. And I tried to explain why Rotterdam changed from a harbor city to a cultural city, and why kids were no longer interested in craftsmanship, the real jobs in the harbor. And I proposed then that within 15 years, we had to bring back craftsmanship into the city. And they were interested. So they came up to me and they said, well, okay, that's a nice idea, Henk, but strategically, but what does it mean tactically and operationally? So do a few things, research. Okay, we're 9 years later now, and I developed the whole program. So I wanted to insert into the educational column, up to the university, all kind of curricula on primary schools, secondary schools, where kids get acquainted with skills, technical skills, ICT skills, eco-literature, eco-literacy, media literacy. And so they gave me money, and I had it scientifically monitored, and the success is quite astonishing. So they still give me money, and about $1 million a year, and I can do what I want to do. So I'm going to show you what I did. And I think the issue with the university, that's what you're asking, so what has it to do with the university, is that I take all students from the university and plug them into the project. I bring them to the people. The people, Turkish, Moroccan, Antillean, Suriname, intercultural society. And I have them do their traineeship in the neighborhoods, in the school. And I train them, and I learn them to train the people. So they learn skills to communicate with people that they would never see, never speak to. So in skilling them, they acquire an openness that probably might help them once they finish their studies. They might even get a job, right? So I'll just give you 10 minutes, just show you a few things. So I think not a university, diversity, that's my idea, right? At least two things we have to connect. No university, diversity. So this is what we are doing, the Enlightenment. From ego demancipation to eco-remancipation. That's the idea. What we did is, well, all my research that I did on interculturality, on all kind of things, on political philosophy, critique on the subject, was all translated to a discourse that I laid on the tables of the policymakers and the politicians. And I convinced them to speak in a different way, to think in a different way, because my successors couldn't be explained by their discourse. That was the issue. So I told them, the individual is gone. 19th century talk. It's gone. There are no individuals. There are networks, and there are nodes in the networks, and in a feedback loop, which we call reflection, the node becomes eco-literate and a media literate. So we have to make feedback loops. We have to think on an ecological way about psychology. So this is what we get. So if you want to empower an individual, empower the network. Don't speak to the individual. Have him do things, practice. Okay? So media literacy, that's what we mean. So the medium, the word is clear enough. Medium means the middle. But we forgot it is the middle. We forgot the medium is an instantiated relation. We think it's a gadget. We consume the gadget. So our radical mediocrity, as I call it, has to be transformed. We are rooted in the world via our media, and we think the media is the world. So how do you open up the medium and get people interested again? Hannah Arendt, interesse. In between. Deleuze, in between. They helped me to formulate it. So I translate Deleuze and Foucault, Arendt, to discourses that people can understand. And they think, that's true. And if I can instantiate it in real results, then they are. For instance, the school that I work in is one of the most poorest neighborhoods in Holland. The kids, they have, at the end of their primary school, they have to do tests. And they call it the CITO-toetsen. And the average of Holland is 535. And the kids in the neighborhood have 537, which is quite good. That is an argument, at least for policymakers and politicians. So these are the two things. So and I translated all those things together. We have to make a threefold enlightenment. Not only the mind has to be enlightened, but the relation has to be enlightened, the medium, and the matter has to be enlightened. So I developed a program for the schools. And the school, I called it Skill City. So the school, I put all those students in the school. Students from the lower vocational education, and they cook in the kitchen, and I inserted this. All kids in the school get judo from 4 years till 12. They all judo. I have a martial art background. I had my own schools, trained in Japan, so I know it works. So they all judo. They all eat at school. They learn to cook their own food. They learn to grow their own food in the gardens that we developed in the neighborhood. And they get all philosophy. So they learn how to fight with their body. They learn how to fight with their mind. They learn how to take care of each other by cooking and by gardening. Because if you don't grow your food well, you can't eat. If you can't eat, you can't play judo. If you can't play judo, you're weak, in a way. It's a very macho philosophy. Isn't it, Rosie? Yeah, it is. I'm the last macho in Holland. Yeah. But she likes me, so it's okay. Okay, but we just inserted all those elements. Judo, and we used that's what I said, I used the language of the policymakers. I speak about targets, human capital, cultural capital. So I stopped reading philosophical books and I started to read policy reports. And I just digested everything and I started to talk like a policymaker. And then over the years I changed the tone, I changed the discourse, and now they talk like me. And that's interesting. That's discourse strategy. That's a discourse strategy. That's how you change the mind. So these are all things that are, and of course you start with judo as violent reduction, but eventually it goes down to reflective interest. That's where we aim at. And then you have kids develop skills and make their own boats, and how do you make the boat go forward? So think about how you invent something to make it go forward. And you have all the parents working in the kitchen, so you participate, and you speak with them, and you put there Antillean and Suriname guys that have to speak with a Turkish woman, which means they have to communicate, which is quite interesting. And all the kids have to learn to cook. And then I can't translate in English, but in Holland you can say, hoe maakt je het? How do you do? But most of the time you think, oh, that's a polite boy, but he just asks, what do you put in the food? Hoe maakt u het? Which is quite different, don't you think so? They are not polite, the boys and the girls, but they are very clever. They are very clever. And we developed whole neighborhoods. You know, the building companies, they break down the houses and they have no money any longer, and then it just becomes ruinous. So what I did was just asking them to use the ground of the houses that disappeared. And instead of, like in the Wire, instead of all those niches where things could happen, kids were planting their food, which gave the neighborhood a completely different outlook. So it's all about strategy, about tactical fields and operational trajectories. So this is the way I like my students to think about their way of handling situations. So they are strategic thinkers, they become strategic thinkers, but their substantial anchoring is relations with people, with real people. So that's the way we do it, physical integrity with the judo, and then the crafts houses that we inserted, and now I'm working on the craft wharves, dealing with big companies in order for them to invest in the city so they get the people with the expertise that they need for their companies. And then eventually it's what Guattari said, les trois écologies. It's a very hard idea. And when you read it, you think, whoa, but it's quite easy. Les trois écologies. It's about the mental, it's about your physical appearance, which is always social because it's mediated and there's always a reflection, so it's mental. And then eventually philosophy is transformed into ecosophy. That's what I want to teach, and that's what I teach at the university. So it is possible to change something in the university, and I always was quite stubborn, but now they really appreciate my stubbornness. So, because the results are okay, but the results were only gained because I left the university. I quit my job for half of my job to do this, because the university was not able nor willing to assist me doing this. So I had to leave the university, and now I'm the darling of the university. And that's the big problem. That is the big problem. So give up your money and start working. So we have all the solar panels and all this kind of stuff. It's nice. And when I forget what I'm doing, I go to the schools and then I know what I'm doing. This is the biggest argument. Not a book. This is the biggest argument. I'll take the policymakers to the schools and they're convinced. Just like that. And that's nice. Somalian girl making electric circuit. That's nice. She wouldn't ever do it. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Let's start just and immediately answer the questions that you have. Let's not save them up so we don't lose momentum. Anyone?
Thank you. Well, it's again a comment. Thank you very much for these presentations. I think that they inform an enormous amount of things that I'm thinking about now. But perhaps the last one, I think that the last one I appreciated so much because it actually, to me, it very well showcased the one element of this modus operandi that, to me, public intellectual has, is the specific, you have to take a stand of like to be a bit naive in terms of not to forget that sometimes you have to repeat things and again, and that, for instance, you mentioned that students can be strategic thinkers or pupils can be strategic thinkers, but public officials can also be strategic thinkers, but sometimes it takes time to not to forget that if you try to make your point once, you have to have the courage to make it again and again and again. And I get to share probably the biggest joy that I've ever had is that when after almost a year of co-working together with certain program managers for civil protection, public funding, basically the whole system in Sweden, one person who was such a typical bureaucrat suddenly in his explanation started introducing a word discourse and conceptualization. And he was surprised himself, but there was this stand of being a bit of naive, and that's why I think that example of how you work with this mediation to children, to students is so good, and we should really think about it more. Thank you.
Actually, I would really love for I see a lot of young people in the audience, I would love for one of you to ask either of the speakers how they could reoccupy the public space, because that's what we've been talking about really, or how they themselves could become a public intellectual for, just using that word. Because you, for instance, I saw you when our last speaker said something about the young generation being media savvy but not media literate. I saw you saying, well, is that true? I was interested to know what you were thinking at that moment, so maybe. Sorry for putting you on the spot like that.
Well, we were also just in the break, we were talking about like activism and doing something, and I really like going out of the university. I mean, I just did my bachelor's and now I'm not doing anything, but I want to like learn society, or know the world we live in and not just the academic world, to maybe after that appreciate academia more, like knowing what you want to learn. So I really liked the university, going outside of the university and going into multicultural society and the real world, and how can you like find those connections. That was what I really found inspiring about the project in Rotterdam. I think we should do it in the Netherlands as a whole.
So you would choose to be like Henk? That's what you're saying,
well,
right?
I mean, this is a little bit stupid, but I would like to invite Henk Oosterling for a little platform I have. Perfect. Here in Utrecht. But there's a thing, and there's actually a question I have, which is occupying my mind lately a lot, and that's I organize student nights, and it started with students, and now it's young people, but it's all higher educated, white, my age people.
So very old, yeah.
But and there was a theater maker who said, like, I would like to talk about the idea of an intellectual elite, because there is an intellectual elite, And people in the audience say often, why is it always about this elite? We are not an elite. So I would like to ask the people who spoke to us so inspiring, what they think of the idea of young academics or something as an intellectual elite. I was wondering your reflections about that.
Henk, maybe? Or?
I can give an answer.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I wonder. It depends on how you redefine the modern category of elite, because I think we all wear the same Levi's, G-Star. We all drive in the same car. We have the same media with which we communicate. So, what is the exact distinctive feature of elite nowadays? White, middle-aged, rich. What is it? What is elite?
People, to me, people say you are part of an elite. You can do something in society because you're higher educated, and you have the education. So what then is our role? Why am I that and not other people? I mean, should we think of ourselves as different from other people?
Yeah. But as I understand you, people say to you that you are the elite.
Well, and the people I...
Yeah, right. Yeah. And then, once they have defined you as elite, they say, is there anybody out there? Can somebody help me? Like the guy on the elevator. Is there anybody out there? That's why they say it. Because then someone else can do. Because once you say, I'm stupid, I can't understand what's happening. You're smart, so come on, help me. Which is quite nonsense. You're all connected, you're all there. Everybody can do everything. Those women over there in the kitchen, they take part in public life now, and they can develop their talents. You have to create situations for people, create practices for people. Don't tell them what they have to do, create practices. And you don't have to be an elite to create practices. So the whole idea of elite and mass is gone. It's 19th century, I think.
Just one quick comment from Joan, and then okay. I didn't.
It does not mean that there's power concentration, of course.
No, it's okay. Greg.
Thank you, and this has been a really wonderful way of framing some of the discussion of the earlier issues. One of the things I was reflecting is all of the speakers around the question of the change of the media, but also of the public, but also of the intellectual. I mean, all of these things have been, all of these subjectivities, all of these nodes and networks have changed, is one of the most devastating effects, and I think this picks up from the discussions this morning, is that there has been a distinctive change in the language of the discursive practices of the university itself in terms of its knowledge economy, but specifically of its language, which is neoliberal to its core, which is why the metrics are being employed and so forth by an administrative and specialized class. The problem is that in response, and Henk, your talk really made me reflect on this, in response, faculty began to see that that language or that discursive practice was the one invested with power, and began reproducing that language among themselves within the department context in order to make arguments that they thought would be more effective. In doing so, the entire institution was transformed almost overnight, well, not overnight, over a period of 20 years. So your model got me to think how you talked about taking possession and beginning to transform that language back, which would mean that we become specialists of the university again and begin to retrain the idea of the administrative language to begin, but in doing so, to, in a sense, produce new discursive practices, and that is the resistance of that neoliberal language within our own departments and contexts. So I wonder if your model, Henk, I mean, your language was specific. I can't see myself going to an administrator and saying, I want to have judo as the first requirement of every liberal arts major. But I could see that we could create different languages to use, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that we should not be using that language, and here I think I disagree with the other speakers. I think that we should be resisting using that neoliberal language, and actually I think that there is a space already there that for the languages that we actually specialize in, the language of knowledge, of justice, of truth, of those sorts of issues. So I feel very unhappy about talking about knowledge economy, etc., etc. And I also feel very unhappy about this dichotomy between the real world and the academic world, because actually I think it's the wrong way to look at it. And actually, there is no distinction between them. I mean, we live in the real world, and the moment we publish anything, it is out there in the real world, and of course our private world are inflected totally in, with the public. So I just think it's a very unhelpful way to think about it. And the other thing about reoccupying public space, I think there are a lot of different models that can be used to do that. And I think one of the really interesting models is actually the one in the squares of Athens and elsewhere in Greece, where the public squares were occupied by peoples who were all basically given a ballot to speak, and then that was pulled out of a hat. And that was a very interesting model that enabled real discourse between peoples from different political and social economic, etc. Backgrounds. And I thought that was very interesting. I mean, there was one major sign that I really loved, which said, we want people from all political parties, but we don't want the political parties. But this did give a public space for these kind of things, and that's just one model of many.
Alexander, would you like to weigh in?
Well, I don't. One point I might pick up on, which you had mentioned, which I think maybe I might be able to comment, is the difference between media savvy and media literate. Because I see it, I teach younger people, I teach young journalists, and so I'm often struck about the really interesting generational divide between myself and my students. I grew up with print newspapers and expecting to have a newspaper arrive at my door in the morning and having it be part of my life, that I would read the New York Times from the first page to the last page of the A section, and my students read, I can't even get them, even though the New York Times is distributed for free on the campus, and I say, read it, bring it to class so we can talk about, when issues come up, we can refer to it. They read online, they read in a very different way. I read vertically from top to down, they read horizontally, they read across different platforms. So in some cases, they're incredibly savvy, they read all sorts of things I don't do, they make connections that I might not make, so they're extremely media savvy, they're very aware of spin more than perhaps any other generation. They're aware how much manipulation goes on in the contemporary world. But it's not quite the same, as you said, being media literate, which is having a deeper context. Part of it is just a question of age and time. One acquires that through a process of sedimentation, of having seen the same things over and over again a certain number of times in different forms. And that's where, for example, something like the humanities comes in, is having context, understanding where to put things. And so it's not that they're incredibly savvy, incredibly smart, and can do things. What I find, and what I think is actually really healthy about the digital era, is I now find myself in the rather fun position of having my former students come in and co-teach with me, or in some case I took a class taught by a former student of mine on media aggregation, something I didn't know how to do. So that they're so much more digitally literate, let's say, than I am. And so it really is a dialogue. The idea, the traditional notion of the university of, you were talking about the elite, it used to be the classic thing of where the professor arrived, he read from a book in many cases, and the students literally copied down what the professor said. Now it's much more interactive. My students, as I would be the first to admit, know things I don't know, and it's very, very interactive, both in the classroom but also in the world that we live in. The media universe that we live in is one, as you said, it's very, very interconnected and very interactive. And so it opens up all sorts of very interesting spaces for younger people to actually do things. Many people will ask me, well, so what's the future of journalism? How's it all going to work out? How this whole economic thing? And I tell them, well, you're more likely to figure that out than I am because you grew up using these digital skills. You will actually are more likely to understand how you could find a way to make a website economically viable or something like that, because that's the water that you've been swimming in, for better or worse. I'm a creature of the 20th century. And I think in terms of print and certain types of ways of expressing myself. And so I'm very encouraged, actually. I find that my students are more optimistic than my colleagues who are my age, who have a very doom and gloom and apocalyptic view of where the world is going, whereas my students have been swimming in this very precarious, risky, uncertain, problematic world that you're all growing up in. But they know it, and it's familiar to them, and they accept its riskiness and its complexity, and they have a very good idea of what they're doing. So I'm actually quite optimistic as a result of my relationship with people in their 20s and 30s who are figuring out how to live in this world.
Can I add something to it, to this? Just small one.
It's very small.
Because the media literate eventually means that you have to be in a reflexive mode in relation to your medium. So the savvy part is you know how to deal with it. But the literate part is that you can take a distance and recontextualize it and realize that the medium is a relation and not a root in the world. And then literacy gets the mode that we used to implant via literature in the humanities in our students.
Well, but it's also, that's where historical context is key. For example, it's very easy for someone today to believe that the world was invented the day before yesterday. To understand, for example, that when the telegraph was invented, it worked in many ways like the internet did now, and it was first a free-for-all of people doing things. Radio was the same way. So if you're aware of that history, you can actually better understand what's happening, and that's part of the function of education in the age.
I think Joan wanted to comment.
Well, the discussion went off in a completely different direction, but I was struck, the name of this session is The Public Role of the Intellectual, how easily it slipped into talking about public intellectuals. And it seems to me there's a real difference between a public intellectual and the public role of the intellectual defined as a university scholar. And I just think we need to think about that a little bit. The history of public intellectuals, in fact, is one in which public intellectuals are not based in universities, for one thing, so that the return to the internet may be a return or the possibilities that existed at the beginning of the 20th century that then didn't further on. But then there's also the whole, and I'm just sort of thinking loosely now, but what is it that gives the person who is a public intellectual the recognition as that voice? Is it possible to have any kind of consensus about who counts as a public intellectual anymore, given the enormous divisions that exist? I mean, I was thinking when you were talking about the internet, that on the one hand, and doing that wonderful back and forth, on the one hand there are these limits, on the other hand there are these positive things, but that world of the internet is also fractured in ways that at least my image of what we used to think of as public intellectuals isn't. So I go to my liberal websites, right, and somebody else goes to their conservative websites, and there's no...
Exactly, and Google algorithms will make sure the Google effect will make sure that you go to
the ones
you've
already gone to.
You know you want
But
them before you
yes,
want them.
yes.
but in any case, the point is, I think, what are these publics to whom intellectuals speak? What are these publics who do or do not recognize the intellectual as an important spokesperson for something? And the one other piece of it is what seems to me to have happened to those public intellectuals that somehow we, whoever we are, used to recognize and acknowledge, who could speak out or sign a petition and have it make a difference, that now there are a certain number, and certainly all academics do not count as public intellectuals, all scholars do not count as public intellectuals, but then there are those celebrity scholars who do count. What does that mean for this notion of informing a public or creating a public that receives certain kinds of knowledge that's taken to be expert, valid, raises the level of discussion, whatever else we want to have happen when we think about public intellectuals?
Well, part of that, I mean, when you're saying that comes to mind is that in one sense it's very easy to quantify. We live in the age of data, so the easy answer of that is, you know, what's your clout score? How many followers do you have on Twitter? How many people follow your Facebook page or have visited your blog? So in one sense it's an extremely easy question to answer in a very superficial way. And what you have, for example, in journalism, but I think it's also probably true in academia, is that this is the age, to use the very ugly but very common term, of branding. I teach it in journalism school, where journalists have to learn how to create their own brand. It's horrible to find ourselves using this language for the world of Madison Avenue advertising, but it is the coin of the realm in the sense, which is that on the one hand, it does offer an individual person the possibility of creating something that then has a following. And this can often be very good. You know, I don't have a problem with the fact that Paul Krugman has become an international brand. He's a really smart, informed guy. But of course, it also leads to a lot of hucksterism and you know, showmanship for the sake of showmanship, of people who just put out provocative tweets in order to get large numbers of people following them saying nothing. So, as I said, it's really mixed, but I think the problem is that we're in the middle of, you know, what is, objectively speaking, probably as big a technological change as print was, and it took a couple of centuries to be clear what the impact of print would be. It may not take as long as that because we're moving faster, but we're still very much in the middle of it. But the good news is that there are spaces there, and one has to try to occupy them, consistent with one's dignity and sense of purpose. But those things are there, and you sometimes see people making enormous creative use out of it. You take, for example, this guy Nate Silver, who's a statistician, starts out doing sports statistics, then he does incredible predictions on presidential elections, get hired by the New York Times. He becomes so big, his brand is so big, that he can leave the New York Times and go to ESPN. That's the kind of thing, of figures like that used to be dependent on institutions which provided the brand. Now the individual creates a brand, and there are good things about that and things that make one a little uneasy.
I mean, I'm arguing
we need
explicitly.
to wrap up, so
yeah, I'll be very, very quick. I'm arguing explicitly against these two definitions of intellectual, public intellectual. And I actually do agree. I think it's very, very important to make a distinction between the public intellectual and the intellectual in a public sphere. I think they are very, very different things. And I was trying to make the argument that that second, intellectual in the public, can be an expert, can be an academic. That is very different from public intellectual, which conventionally and traditionally, as you know, is from the university, but the public intellectual differs from the expert and the scholar or the academic in that they have an explicitly political role for the public good, and that is, I think, the major difference between those categories.
Thank you. I would love to go on for hours, but we need to wrap up and go to the next panel. Thank you very much.